The winds howled through the desolate landscape, carrying with them the thick, yellowish haze of the radioactive storm. Far in the distance, the city of Azrael lay hidden beneath a thick layer of protective shields. It was a city where humans and aliens coexisted, a gleaming beacon of technology and progress. But outside its walls, the world had been ravaged. The land was scorched, the air was toxic, and those who lived in the wilderness were often forced to survive by any means necessary. Caden Mitchell was one such survivor. He had been traveling for days, crossing vast stretches of barren wasteland, trying to make his way back to civilization after a failed supply run. His equipment was running low, and with the storm on the horizon, he knew he had to find shelter quickly or risk becoming part of the radioactive ash that would soon be falling from the sky. He stumbled across a small outpost, a lone building half buried in the sand and dust. It wasn't much, but it offered a chance for safety. As Caden approached the building, he saw a figure slumped against the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale, her clothes tattered, and her body trembling in the wind. Caden's heart skipped a beat. There was something about her that drew him in. Her fragile appearance, the way her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She looked like she had been exposed to the storm for far too long. Without thinking, Caden rushed over to her. His heart raced as he knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her skin was burning hot, and her clothes were damp with sweat, but her eyes fluttered open as she tried to focus on him. She gasped for air, her voice barely a whisper. "Please help me," she said, her voice shaky. Caden didn't hesitate. He carefully lifted her into his arms and carried her inside the shelter. The storm outside began to pick up in intensity, the howl of the wind mixing with a low rumble of thunder. He quickly covered her with his cloak, trying to shield her from the cold that seemed to be creeping into her bones. The cloak, a heavy, thick garment meant to protect against the harsh desert conditions, was the only thing he had left that might help her. He had no idea who she was or how she ended up out here, but she needed help, and that was all that mattered. The storm raged outside, but inside the shelter, it was quiet. The woman's breathing began to steady, though she still looked weak and disoriented. Caden sat beside her, watching her carefully, making sure she didn't slip into unconsciousness again. Her long, dark hair was tangled with dust, and her delicate features were almost hidden beneath a layer of grime. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and how she had ended up alone in this wasteland. As the hours passed, the storm outside seemed to grow even more violent. The building creaked and groaned as the wind battered against its walls, but Caden refused to leave her side. He didn't know much about her, but he knew one thing. She had been caught in the storm just like him, and he couldn't leave her to die out here. She finally stirred again, her eyes fluttering open once more. She looked up at him, her gaze filled with confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but her voice was too weak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "My name's Caden," he replied, his voice rough. "I found you outside. You were in trouble, so I brought you in. You've been exposed to the radioactive storm, so you need to rest and recover." She blinked, still disoriented, but then something in her eyes shifted. There was a recognition there, something that Caden couldn't quite place. "You're not afraid?" she asked, her voice growing stronger. "Not afraid of me?" Caden furrowed his brow. "Why would I be afraid of you?" She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to say more. Then, finally, she spoke again. "I'm the Princess of Azrael," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "My name is Alina. I was sent away to protect me from the political turmoil back home, but I was caught in the storm, and the ship I was supposed to escape on crashed. Now I have no way back." Caden was stunned. A princess? Here, in the middle of nowhere? He couldn't believe it. He had been helping a royal, someone of incredible importance, and he hadn't even known it. He felt a strange mix of embarrassment and awe. But what struck him more was how she had been abandoned to die in the storm. The princess, the heir to an entire civilization, had been left to fend for herself in the radioactive wasteland. "I didn't know," Caden said, still trying to process everything. "I didn't know who you were. I just saw someone in trouble and I helped." Alina smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter now. You saved my life." Caden sat down beside her again, his mind racing. The storm outside had not let up, but he knew he couldn't stay here forever. He needed to get her back to Azrael, but there was no telling how long that would take, and the radioactive storms were unpredictable. He was stuck, and so was she. But Caden wasn't the type to give up. If the storm didn't kill him, he'd find a way to get Alina back to her home. She had been abandoned, but Caden was not one to abandon people in need. He would get her out of here, no matter what it took. Days passed, and the storm finally began to subside. Caden and Alina were both physically exhausted, but Alina's health had improved thanks to Caden's care. They had built a makeshift shelter inside the outpost and worked together to ration their food, though it wasn't much. Caden had used his mechanical skills to scavenge parts from nearby ruins, trying to fix a damaged radio that might allow them to call for help. One day, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in what felt like forever, they heard the unmistakable hum of a ship's engines. Caden rushed outside, squinting against the sunlight, and saw a small, sleek ship descending through the sky. It landed nearby, kicking up dirt as it touched down. The hatch opened, and two figures stepped out. The first was a tall man in uniform, flanked by a pair of soldiers. He looked around the wreckage before locking eyes with Caden and Alina. Caden could tell that he was no ordinary officer. This was someone with power. "Princess Alina," the officer said, bowing respectfully. "We've been looking for you. Your father sent us. It's time to go home." Alina stood up, her legs trembling but steady. She turned to Caden, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," she said softly. "I wouldn't be here without you." Caden shook his head, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. "I didn't do it for any reward," he replied. "I just did what needed to be done." But Alina's eyes softened. "You saved me when no one else would, and for that, I will always be grateful." As the soldiers helped Alina to the ship, Caden felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had risked everything for someone he didn't even know. He had made a choice, and it had changed everything. He may have been just a man from a small corner of the universe, but his actions had proven that even in the darkest of times, humanity's greatest strength was in its willingness to help others. And as the ship took off, carrying Alina back to her kingdom, Caden stood alone in the wasteland, knowing that he had done something that truly mattered.